Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Lord,
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining me here again today at Re-Written Vintage Homestead. I've been telling you in my last several episodes that this month, the month of February, is African American Heritage Month. And one of my favorite African Americans in history to read about is Frederick Douglass. And the information I'm going to give you today is firsthand knowledge. It was written by him. It's his life story, and it's called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. So, like I've said in a lot of my historical videos in the past, firsthand knowledge is the best. So if you can get that, then you know the facts. And then you work your way from there. So this is a really interesting story. So that's why I decided to start with him for this month's celebration. So I hope you'll join me. So Frederick Douglass was born in 1818 in Maryland. His name was Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey when he was born. His master was rumored to be his father. And his master was the superintendent of a huge plantation. But his master only owned 3 small farms and was not considered wealthy. He had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. And in the first several chapters of the book, Frederick talks about how he can't really relate to the other slaves because he's too little. And when you're elderly or when you're young, very young like he was, they find other jobs for you to do. You're not put out in the plantation, and you're typically not whipped because you're either a house slave or you're a yard slave. And so when he was little, he was considered a yard slave. So he would take care of the chickens and the fowl. He would keep the yard clean and do small tasks like that, move cattle from place to place. He was raised by his grandmother because when slaves were born, they were immediately taken away from their mother. And that was done on purpose so that no bonds were formed, no family bonds. And Frederick was raised with, he had older brothers, older sister that lived in the same house that he did. However, there were no bonds there. There was no closeness. Like he said, I knew they were my brothers and sisters. You know, we weren't close. We didn't have any history together. We were all immediately separated when we were born. We weren't allowed to congregate together. So, you know, there wasn't any family loyalty except for Frederick's grandmother, who raised them all until they were old enough to go to the fields to work. Frederick describes his father, who was, let's remember, his slaveholder, as cruel and mean. The first whipping that he saw was of his aunt. His aunt apparently had a love interest, a slave in another encampment, and she had been caught sneaking over to visit him. Now, Frederick thinks that his father actually wanted her for himself, and that's why he was so cruel in his whipping of her, and he whipped her to the point that she passed out. And Frederick was a little boy hiding in the kitchen watching this. He couldn't believe it. So that is the first several chapters. He talks about living on the farm where his father owned that plantation. Another thing to remember is Frederick believes his father was the slave owner, His brother and sisters probably were too. They were his father too. That gave you no kind of special privilege because the slaveholder had to show that you would be treated the same as everybody else. And so sometimes your punishment was actually worse. The mistress of the house, of course, resented you because of where you came from. And so they were unusually harsh on the children too. So it was a no-win situation. And the best thing you could do was just try to stay out of everyone's way and do what you were told. Frederick talks about how even if what your master told you was wrong, and you knew it was going to cause a hardship, such as with a lame horse or with the field work or with weather or whatever, you kept your mouth shut. And for the few slaves that would open their mouth and try to correct their owners, they suffered dire consequences. Frederick described that children that were slaves often ran around with no clothes on whatsoever because their master would have had to buy them clothing or give them clothing, which they weren't willing to do. Every now and then you might see a child in a shirt, but that's it. No pants, no shoes, no socks. They did not have beds. Typically, there was one cot given to a family that the mother or the father would sleep on. The children had no cots. They had no blankets. The summer would be bearable if they slept outdoors or could find a cool place to sleep. But the winter he described as occasionally praying that he would die because they would be so cold with no clothes, no blankets, in a little shanty shack. So their treatment was never, ever humane. When he was about 7 or 8 years old, he was told that he was going to be sent to live in Baltimore to begin learning to work and to be a companion to his new master's son, who was about his age. And he was very excited because, like he said, it couldn't be any worse than where I'm leaving, and the excitement of living in a big city. So his master's daughter started getting him prepared to go. She said, "We have got to scrub you up. You've got to get rid of the dead skin on your feet and on your knees. You have to wash your hair because we want you to be presentable when you make it there to the city." He got a new set of clothes. He said they were the first pair of trousers he ever owned in his life. He was 8 years old. So he was beyond excited. He was going to go live with the brother of the owner's son-in-law. His name was Hugh Auld. And when he got there, a woman answered the door who happened to be Hugh's wife, and her name was Sophia. And Frederick describes her as being the kindest face in a white woman he had ever seen. He said she actually smiled at him when she opened the door. She was kind to him. She asked him if he wanted something to drink. She treated him like a human being, and he thought, what's going on here? But that's how she continued to treat him. He would spend his days playing with his new master's son, and they made other friends in the neighborhood, other little white boys. Frederick talked about how some of these new white boys that became his friends were the kindest, sweetest friends, and he still cherished their memory in his adulthood because they would cry when he would tell them stories about slavery. He would tell them that he was still a slave, and that would make them sad. So there were good people everywhere that thought slavery was a bad thing. But Frederick Douglass also talks about how the power of slavery, how owning a slave can totally change a person. And he uses Sophia Auld as an example of this. So he asked Sophia if she would teach him to read. And she happily did. She was a nice, sweet person. And so she started teaching him his ABCs, how to sound words out. He would talk about how when he would go play with the other white boys in the neighborhood, that they would write out letters for him in the dirt and try to help him figure out what letters they were and put words together. And once this started, he couldn't stop. He could not stop because he found out information. He would go to his master's house and he would find a book. He would open that book and try to sound out the words. And he started reading about what was going on around him and reading about slavery and the abolitionist movement. Now, he was just a little boy, but this is where the fire was lit there in Baltimore. But he also describes how his Sophia's husband, Hugh, walked in on them one day when she was teaching him to read and threw a fit. He started telling her, "You don't realize how dangerous this is, because when you teach a slave to read, they're going to turn on you. Knowledge is power, right? They're going to turn on you. They're going to use this to turn on slaveholders, to turn on all of us. So we have to keep them uneducated." And he said, "You have a responsibility now. You have a place in society as a slaveholder. So they are not your equal." Now, up until this time, Sophia treated him as maybe not her equal, but definitely as a human. She had never owned slaves before. Her family weren't wealthy. They had never owned slaves before. But Frederick talks about how she became almost drunk with power after that. That she stopped teaching him letters and teaching him how to read. She would be short in her answers. She would be cold, not warm in her affection towards him, which she was before. So basically, she shut him off and started treating him as his owner. He doesn't describe that she ever whipped him, but definitely changed her demeanor towards him. And it broke his heart because he really did care a lot about her. When he told his little white friends about this, they were heartbroken too. And he said, "Now I'm never going to learn how to read." But they did everything they could to keep him going. They would bring him pages to read. They would bring him their old school books. They would try to help him any way that they could. So what he's stressing in this chapter is that slavery not only demeaned the slave and turned them into something else other than human, but also the slaveholder, how it totally changed them and the way that they believed. His owner had an enlightenment and became a Christian while Frederick lived with him. This is Hugh. And deeply, deeply religious. And so started having the family attend church all of the time. And this kind of, Frederick believed in God too. But this really made him think about the hypocrisy of it all. Here you say that you care about humans. God is about love, but you're treating other people this way. You're a hypocrite. And so, that's even something that carries on today with a lot of people when they wear their Christianity on their sleeve. It can turn around to bite them if they're seen or heard doing something that is against the Bible's teachings. And it can turn people away from Christianity, actually, which is something that Frederick was dealing with at that time. Around 1833, now Hugh Auld was the brother of his master's son-in-law, Thomas Auld. Well, around that time, Thomas Auld and Hugh Auld started bickering. And Frederick doesn't really talk much about what that was about. However, Thomas Auld apparently said, I want my slave. So Frederick had to go live then in St. Michael's, Maryland, to live with Thomas Auld. He was very sad about that. He talks about how when he lived with Hugh Auld, it was very respectable for slave owners to feed their slaves in that part of the country. You were considered upper crust if you took good care of your slaves. Now, you could still beat the hell out of them and not let them go free, but you must keep them clothed and you must keep them fed. And Hugh Auld was very good at that. Thomas Auld didn't care. And so Thomas Auld and his wife are described as being utmost cruel. They whipped their slaves all the time for reasons that sometimes were very, very petty. And they weren't fed. They were starved. So Frederick talks about how they had to rely on other slaveholders on other plantations to give them food. They would go begging. So Thomas Auld was not even held in high regard with other slaveholders holders in that area. Frederick still had a quest for learning, and he met a white minister there, a young man. He talks about a very young man who said, you know, if you get together a group of your friends or other slaves that you're acquaintance with, if they would like to learn and go to church, I'd be happy to meet with them on Sundays and we could have our own slave church and school. Well, he was very, very excited about this, and he did get together a group, and they did meet on Sundays, and they would learn to read, and they would learn about the Bible. And this lasted 3 or 4 times until they were found out, where they were beaten and told that they could never meet again. This was probably viewed as some type of conspiracy for freedom, which it was not, but they were no longer allowed to meet. Frederick talks about in this chapter that he would watch the boats come and go, and that if it were not for the idea of freedom, that someday he would be free, he would have killed himself. And he often thought about suicide because this type of life, there was nothing worth living for. It was during his stay with Thomas Auld that Frederick and several other slaves decided to try to make a run for it. But they were caught and they were sent to jail. Upon his release, he was sent to live with a Mr. Covey. Now, this Mr. Covey was considered to be a slave breaker who would whip you into submission so that you would listen to your owner. So Thomas Auld had signed into an agreement with Mr. Covey that Frederick would be his slave for 1 year, long enough to break his spirit. This was an awful, awful year. So during this time, he had to work in the fields. He talks about it doesn't matter what the weather was, rain, snow, sleet, ice, heat, you had to work. And if you didn't, you were beaten. Mr. Covey was extremely cruel. He had a reputation to uphold, of course. So in this chapter, Frederick talks about how he had never run oxen before. He'd never been around the beast before, but he was given the job of driving a team back and forth through the woods to pick up supplies. While he kept losing the wagon would tip over. The oxen would get free, then he would get them back together, and then it would tip over again. And when Mr. Covey would catch him, he would beat him. And he tried to explain to him, I've never done this before. I don't know what I'm doing. That didn't matter. He beat him continually. He talks about midway through his year there with Mr. Covey, they had a disagreement, and Mr. Covey wanted him to do something that Frederick was trying to do, but not to his liking. And so Mr. Covey kicked him in the side and knocked him down. And Frederick gets back up and he gets kicked again. Mr. Covey picks up a log, hits him in the head with it, and starts beating him with it. And Frederick talks about, how he wished he would continue to do it until he died. Just be done with me. I can't do this anymore. Finish me off. But something happened, and he said during a quick minute there, he got a moment of clarity that he was going to go back to Thomas Auld's house, his slave owner, and ask for mercy. He said he doesn't know where he got the strength, but he started running. And that this Mr. Covey tried to catch up with him, but couldn't. And so it was 7 miles from that field back to where Thomas Auld lived. And Frederick talks about when he finally got there, the sight of him was enough to turn anyone's stomach and soften anyone's heart. And he said, I believe I did soften Thomas Auld's heart for a moment because he began pacing the floor and didn't know what to do. He would go back and forth between, this is sickening, to, well, you probably deserved it. He ended up saying, you can stay here tonight. My wife will take care of your wounds. You're not going to have dinner and you will not have breakfast for running away because I signed an agreement with this man. You have to stay with him for a year. But you will go back to him in the morning. And if you don't go back to him in the morning, then you're going to have to deal with me. So it didn't do any good. So Frederick goes back 7 miles the next morning to Mr. Covey. And when Mr. Covey sees him, of course, he's going to beat the tar out of him. But like Frederick explained, at this point, he didn't care. Kill me. I don't care. Any of you, kill me and put me out of my misery. And so Mr. Covey started beating him. And for some reason, Frederick said, it was probably because he didn't care, that he fought him back. And he fought him back good. And he beat the tar out of him. And then he expected some course of punishment for doing that. But what he actually did was put the fear of God in Mr. Covey. And after that happened, he was never beaten again. He finished out his year working for Mr. Covey, and then he was sent to a Mr. Freeland's farm by his master to work for him for some time. And he states in his book that Mr. Freeland was actually the best slave owner he ever had. He called him a Southern gentleman. He took care of his slaves. Once again, he was being fed. He was being clothed. They could still be punished, but it was not unreasonable. He didn't go looking for a reason to beat you. But other than death, the thought of freedom had never left Frederick's mind, and he made his mind up. There will be a time when I'm either dead or I'm free. And so he made his mind up, I'm going to be free. Now, I know this can get real confusing, but I'm going to try to break it down again. So there was a huge plantation owner, okay? This plantation owner hired Captain Anthony. Captain Anthony was Frederick's dad, okay? Captain Anthony was not a wealthy plantation owner. He had 3 small farms of his own. And And so he was hired as an overseer for the huge plantation. Okay. The man who owned the huge plantation had a son-in-law named Thomas Alt, who had a brother named Hugh Alt. And as people died off, as they had arguments, and they started losing property, that type of thing, Frederick was sent to live back and forth between Thomas and his brother Hugh. So eventually he was sent back to live with Hugh. And so Hugh started teaching him how to do caulking and shipyard work. And so he would take him to the shipyards, and he would have him work for different shipbuilders and learn the trade. And Hugh really tried to teach him a trade that would make money. And of course, this money then went back to Hugh, which Frederick resented. But there was a strange sort of feeling of accomplishment to do a job and actually get paid for it. And so he became very good at it. The other shipmates that he had that worked on the same cruise as him started to resent him. They didn't like working with a black man, a slave. Frederick met some other slaves there that were working. He became very good friends with them. One of them was a free man. He was not a slave. He was a free black man. Now, your slave owners could sell your freedom. Somebody could buy your freedom. And a lot of abolitionists would do that. They would buy someone's freedom. And that's what happened to this gentleman. So he had free papers. And so he and Frederick became very good friends. And they started scheming a type of plot where Frederick could use his papers to escape. But that would take some planning, and it would take some money, and they would have to find someone who would let him board their boat to escape. And so he would work every day. He would make money, and then he'd have to go back and give it to Hugh Alt. And but he was grateful that, he was fed, he was clothed, he was learning a trade. One day at the shipyards, he had an experience much as like he had when he was working for the slave beater, Mr. Cobby. And the other men on the ship started calling him names and derogatory names, and didn't want to work with him, and basically jealous of him. He was a very good worker. And they began beating him. But this time, much unlike the way Thomas Alt reacted, you go back there or I'm going to beat you myself. When he went home to Hugh Alt was disgusted. He said that once again he saw the softness in Hugh's wife, Sophia, as she tended to his wounds and cared for him and fed him. They were both disgusted. So it talks about the slaveholders again, certain slaveholders who, because of where they lived and what was ingrained in them, that they were above these people and that they had a place in society. They acted a certain way, but yet some of them still had, thank God, humanity, where things like this turned their stomach, and they knew slavery was wrong, but it was hard for them to justify, or I don't want to say to justify letting go of the slaves, but they still had a whole community who believed in slavery, so it would be hard for them to break out of that as well. A lot of them use the Bible to justify the treatment of the slaves and for owning slaves. So he was very happy when Hugh went back to the shipyards and complained and said that Frederick would never be back. He would never be back to work on that ship again or work with that crew again, and they better not ever touch him again, or they would be dealing with him. So he found another crew, but he still wanted to be free. So he started skimming money. So instead of giving Hugh all of his money, he would give him part of his money and try to keep some tucked away. And so Hugh would say, "This is all you got today?" And he'd be like, "Well, they didn't let me do this, or I was moved to this job or that job. I didn't make as much, but I really even stayed an extra day." And so Mr. Hugh never really caught on that he was skimming money because he was still giving him money. And he saved up enough money that he could buy passage on a boat that this other slave had secured for him. So he took his free slave papers with him. I believe he paid $9 to this ship operator to take him to New York. And that's how he escaped. It was like an underground railroad type of thing. So once he got to New York, he had already been told by this other slave where to go. These people will help you. They're abolitionists. They're white. They'll make sure you're fed. They'll make sure you're clothed, and they'll help you get somewhere else. So once he got to New York, he was told, even though this is a free state, we don't have slaves, it's not safe here. This is an important part of history you don't hear much about, but even though you had your states in the North that were free states, they had quite a few abolitionists who didn't believe in slavery. They had many in the North who'd be glad to capture you and take you back to the South for a reward. So the idea, just because you lived in the North didn't mean you were a free man. And so people had asked Frederick about that before. How did you feel when you got off the boat there in a free state? And he said, "I wasn't free. I didn't know who I could trust and who I couldn't." It was a scary time. So when he went to live for a short time with these people in New York, they asked him, "Where do you want to go? Because we have to get you out of here." And he told them, "I know the ship trade. I know how to caulk. I know how to work on boats. I'd like to do something like that so I could earn a living." So they found a way to send him to Connecticut. And in Connecticut, that's when he met his wife and was married. Eventually, Frederick starts working as an unskilled laborer, and the money he makes is his own. They're living with another family. And it's during this time that there are actually printed materials that talk about abolition. There's newspapers, newsletters, that type of thing. And there was going to be a meeting by a historical society that was against slavery. And they were going to be given speeches. And Frederick went, and he asked if he could talk. And he started detailing his life as a slave and why it was an awful practice and why it should be abolished. Well, this kind of blew everybody's mind. You had a black man who lived through it, who could talk about it so eloquently, who knew how to read, who knew how to write. And so they thought, if we hire this man to be a speaker, it's only going to help our cause, because people, if you try to convince a white person at that time that believed in slavery that it was a bad thing, they'd say, they're not like us. They're not educated like us. They would justify it in waves like that. But when you had a man here who was more articulate than you were, more educated. Now, Frederick did not just stop with reading about abolition. He read poets. He read philosophy. He read history. He read everything he could get his hands on. So he was very eloquent, handsome, and very educated. So more and more people would come and listen to him speak. He would travel overseas with other abolitionists. He even started working with Susan B. Anthony for the rights of women to vote. So he believed in freedom for all people, not just African Americans, even women. He talked about how he didn't hate the white man throughout his life. He had Caucasian people, such as Mrs. Sophia, who were kind and would help him. Mr. Freeman, who was a slave owner, who was kind to him. His friends, those dear, sweet little white boys that would try to help him read and write and bring him food. They would steal food, bring it to him. But that slavery changed people. It changed the owners just as much as it changed the slaves. So he spent the rest of his life talking about this. He was huge as far as advocating for black soldiers during the Civil War. And he even went and spoke to Abraham Lincoln several times about the pay that they were earning. They were not earning comparable pay to the white soldiers, the jobs that they were being given to do, and how they were just as important, because actually this was about them, wasn't it? In his eyes. So they should be treated with dignity, just as the white soldiers who were fighting. He had a love-hate relationship with Lincoln. He didn't know that Lincoln really felt in his heart that slavery was a bad thing, or that it should be abolished completely, but that Lincoln started to see that to keep the country united, it had to go. It just absolutely had to go. One interesting story is that during his second inauguration, Frederick Douglass went to hear his speech that Lincoln made. And then he wanted to go in and congratulate him and see him. Now, he'd been to the White House many times. And Lincoln summoned him several times to get his advice on black soldiers and speeches. So, like I said, they had kind of a tumultuous relationship during that time. But when he tried to get in, he was turned away because he was black. But Lincoln saw him and said, no, no, let him in. And he was like, Frederick, what did you think of my speech? And he said, I thought it was very good, very good. And he said, do you know what? Lincoln said, your opinion matters to me. Your opinion of this matters to me more than anybody's. So in my last video, I asked if anyone knew how Chief Joseph, who was the chief of the Nez Perce tribe in the United States, Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Martin Luther King were similar. Now, these are four men, different racial backgrounds, different times in history. How could they possibly be similar? Well, you might start thinking off the top of your head, well, they were all principle resistors. So they believed it deep down in their heart what they were fighting for, and that it was worth fighting for based on their principles, right? Well, but that's obvious. We all know that. So actually, even though these four men were so different, and they were all part of our great, great American history at different times, and they were all different in background and race, they all believed in the power of education. Chief Joseph, his father had converted to Christianity. He later took it back, but he had converted to Christianity. And Chief Joseph was taught in a mission school. And he read everything that he could. He was able to read treaties. And because of that, he entered into treaties with armies and that type of thing that he thought would protect his people. He was educated, and so they wanted to deal with Chief Joseph. He was also a bit of a pacifist. So, but he was an educated Native American during the time that the West was being taken over. Dr. Martin Luther King believed in the power of education. As we learned, Frederick Douglass believed in the power of education. He tried to find everything he could to read and to understand and to interpret. And so did Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, as we've learned throughout history, was very poor growing up, but taught himself to read, taught himself to write, became an attorney. And I hope my children and my grandchildren watch this video someday so that I can convey to them the power of education. Now, by that, I don't mean you have to go to college. I encourage it, but in today's workplace, learning a trade is as valuable as a degree. So it isn't about educating yourself in a college system, but read history, read philosophy, read poetry, read autobiographies, read fiction, read anything you can get your hands on so that you can make an educated decision in this world. There is nothing more powerful than education. And I want to thank the people in our American history who knew that and made our country the great country that it is today. I'm sorry, you guys, I lost it at the end. You know how I feel about American history. I just love it. I love our country. I want to thank you guys so much for joining me here today. I love talking about these kinds of things. Let me know in the comments, who is your favorite person in American history and why? Let's start a conversation. Do you have a favorite African American in our history that you like to read about or that you admire? And share that with all of us. We'll be talking about Chief Joseph shortly. Thank you guys, and I hope you have a wonderful week.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child. Sometimes I feel like a mother.